Hi. Hi, good evening to everyone. I am Dr. Philip Macmillan, and I am just going to be updating you on breaking news that is happening in China. Difference is that I'm not just going to tell you what is happening, I'm going to try and explain to you why what is happening is happening. When everybody seems silent, the scientific community seems lost, nobody quite knows what is going on. I'm still trying to piece these things together to help to guide you through what exactly is happening. Why am I confident of doing it? Largely because we've just published our book. Are you prepared against disease X? It's number one in Amazon at the moment, and you can join us and get a free excerpt here, and or you can just go straight to Amazon to purchase it. We want to keep it there because coincidentally, this is an important time for people to understand this kind of information. So, I'm going to be sharing with you what is happening breaking from China. And I'll then explain to you why I think what's happening in China is very relevant to all of us today. This was in from SARS-CoV-2. This is on X or Twitter. Breaking news. China declares a state of emergency as epidemic overwhelms hospitals and crematoriums. Multiple viruses, including influenza A, HMPV, mycoplasma pneumonia, and COVID 19, are spreading rapidly across China. And this is what the looks like in the emergency rooms there in China. Somebody did a clip of that so that you can see that this is not just made up. And the point that I'm making now is that it's not just that it is happening, but I'm going to share, as I said, why I think it's happening. And critically, I'm going to be giving you some insight into this very interesting virus that very few of us know anything about, which is human metapneumovirus, HMPV. What is it? What's going on? And this is from a research paper in 2018. So this was right before the pandemic. It's not connected with the pandemic. And so it's just giving us independent information to help us to understand a little bit more about what is going on. Before I start, as usual, as we have in the link, other thing that I realize I haven't done enough of is trying to explain to everyone about autoimmunity. I keep on talking about it in relation to COVID-19, and I keep on assuming people understand it, and many people don't. And so I am having an autoimmunity 101, the body's mysterious attack on itself. Register now. This has just been launched. There are tickets available, and we'll be able to go through with you some of the principles and to why I think this is so relevant to autoimmune diseases coming up, and why I think this is going to be rising significantly around COVID 19. So that's the background. And now let's talk about a little more detail about what exactly is happening. The Twitter link showed a number of paper links. This here is all in Chinese, showing the information. Of course, I can't read it. So using Google, I translated this. And what it was pointing out, not all the worlds are perfect, but the citizens exposed that hospitals are overcrowded during the New Year's Eve celebration, just like the spring festival travel rush. And this is what is happening at the moment in China. And you can see that lots of people are seeking treatment in hospitals. There are multiple viruses circulating. They think that they could be new strains, and there are long queues going on. As I said, some bloggers also said that hospitals are now as crowded and bustling as shopping malls. So everybody is seeing this there in China. And the question is, what really is going on? And there is another article from the Chinese information, which shows China enters outbreak phase, hospitals and crematoriums overwhelmed. As you can see here, the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention released a national monitoring report stating that acute respiratory infectious diseases are generally on the rise. Hospitals are overcrowded, especially children's hospitals. And many doctors have warned that it may lead to white lung, which we heard about before, and many parents and patients are posted that they have white lung or pneumonia. Additionally, they have revealed that recently people between the ages of 40 and 80 have died suddenly of unexplained causes in the local area. This is serious stuff. And here is the warning I give to people. Sometimes it can sound as though a lot of this is just to agitate people, get them worried, so that you can do whatever you want with them because they're so afraid. And one of the lessons from the pandemic has been that fear has been driven to make people do things they wouldn't normally do. And I think that the most important thing that you can do now is to stop, to reflect, and to listen. But it doesn't mean that you ignore it. So, where we are now, I think if you can remember back to 2021, and it was about March, April 2021, they started to talk about this virus that was spreading in India. It was a new strain, the Delta variant. And of course, everybody was, well, it's just India, they're having deaths. They didn't realize that exactly the same problem that India was facing was going to be on their back door. And the Delta wave did probably the most deaths in the pandemic, even more than the first part of the pandemic when everybody was before even the lockdowns had come in. The Delta wave was probably one of the most lethal waves of the pandemic. And the lesson I'm telling you is that when you see something unusual happening in another part of the world, if you assume it's not going to happen in your corner, that's just wishful thinking because this problem spreads globally. Now, the reason that I did Disease X is because I am predicting, I am saying this openly, that I think that all of these unusual patterns, or most of them, are likely to be related to COVID 19. The question is, how? In the same way that I predicted this disease X in the Congo, that it wasn't some new virus, it was just going to be something run of the mill, but it was spreading in a different way, and that turned out to be malaria. Again, I'm coming in front of you and I'm saying it straight out before anybody else. I'm telling you what I'm analyzing and hoping that you will listen to it carefully to therefore understand the implications for you and family. So let me just show you a few slides to explain what I am looking at. So let's start with the basics. The first thing that you have is that you have a viral infection. Now, some people don't believe viruses exist. I won't argue with that. I'll just say that something, call it what you will, is spreading from person to person. It's largely spread in aerosol drops. It will then attach onto the lining of the upper airway, replicate itself, and spread eventually down to the lungs. And that's a typical routine for most viral infections. Some of them are just a cold, a rhinovirus, or some of the simpler coronaviruses, and they only cause a bit of nasal stuffiness, maybe a low fever, and that's about it. That's an important starting point for you to understand. Now, the reason that I'm differentiating COVID from just a typical viral infection is largely because of where COVID targets. Now, this is very important. Anyone who tells you that COVID is just another cold or just another variation of flu, it's because they don't fully understand the science. And the science should tell you this is not the same thing. So there's a rat model, and they did this in this paper. Persistence of spike protein in the skull meninges brain axis may contribute to the neurological sequelae of COVID 19. That's what they were focused on. But in it, they did a number of very interesting tests. They did the Wuhan spike, where they infected the mouse models, they injected the spike in them, and they showed what happens with the influenza. What you can see here is that it's just not as highly concentrated, but the spike protein spreads all throughout the body. And this is highlighted here by the injected spike. Depending on how much virus gets into the system will determine where it infects and what damage it can do. Kidneys are lighting up, intestines are lighting up, heart is lighting up, brain is lighting up. This is one frightening piece of work. We have never seen anything like this. So, part of the point is that this is very different from typical things. This is what happens with influenza. As you can see here, this is the lung. It primarily is concentrated in the lungs, as most respiratory viruses. Even when you have viral septicemia, where the virus breaks through into the bloodstream, it doesn't have as many receptors to bind to. But with COVID 19, just remember, look at the image, it binds to almost everything, as you can see here. And so, this is one of the critical differentiators between COVID and most other viruses. Really critical to learn. And then you have to think about, well, how does your immune system deal with these viruses? And especially COVID, it's very sophisticated. I describe it as a immune team with tanks being monocytes, Marines, neutrophils, T cells are the Air Force. It has artillery, B cells. It has the Navy, NK cells, plus has mast cells. Very, very sophisticated immune system that can handle almost any threat. So that's the starting point. But the COVID virus really, really does some unusual patterns that causes it to make you more susceptible to other things. And so everything about COVID is trying to prevent it from getting into the bloodstream. And I have here, this is the mucosal barrier, which will prevent, so the virus can infect up here, but you don't want it penetrating this lining, this almost skin inside the upper airway that prevents the virus from getting into the lymph nodes and into the bloodstream, because that's where all of the damage occurs. If you can keep it out here, wonderful. You may have very mild symptoms or no symptoms at all. But if it gets in here, depending on the amount of virus and how quickly and how much it replicates, will determine then what happens with regards to the symptoms and the ongoing infection. Now, people would say, well, that's just COVID, and if you get past it, you're okay. Now, this is the bit that people don't quite understand, and I need you to be educated so you can educate others. One of the abilities of this virus, because of this very unusual spike protein that we have never seen before, but coincidentally, 1 in 1 trillion has occurred naturally. Anyway, that same spike protein not only infects endothelial and upper airway cells and so on, but it infects specific immune cells. That's very unusual. CD147 to be exact. And what you end up with is an impaired immune system. Your T cells get damaged, your B cells get damaged, especially the regulatory cells. The natural killer cells get damaged. Suddenly, this is not the same army or the defense system that you had. You don't have a weak air force, you don't have enough artillery, you don't have a good navy. You're depending now on just your tanks and your marines. Depending on what the enemy is like, will determine whether or not this gets overwhelmed. And so, this is the important piece of the puzzle as to why I think that this is occurring. So, now let's get back. I've spoken previously about influenza, and you have to remember that when you have this impairment of the immune system, especially with the interferon response, which is the warning flag, on top of that, with damage to the immune cells and therefore mucosal and systemic immunity, you then have a situation where you can have an increased risk of co infections. Let me repeat that. This is a very important concept. Co infections. What that means is that usually, if you get an infection with a virus, and the virus infects cells, it triggers the interferon response. And that interferon response blocks all viruses, not just COVID, not just influenza. It blocks all viruses. But what seems to be happening is that that interferon response is damaged because of persistent virus staying in the upper airway. And this is what I'm worried about. And this is therefore the risk that creates the problem where you then have other infections occurring. And one of them that they mentioned for China is this one: human metapneumovirus. What you need to know. And as I said, this paper was done in 2018. And it's well known to be a leading cause of acute respiratory tract infections, especially in children, immunocompromised patients, and the elderly. Now, hold fire with that thought, because what it is that this virus was only found in 2001. When I say found, it means that the first time they identified it was in 2001. I think in Holland, they were looking at some viral cultures and they found it there. But it's always been around, but it tends to not cause severe illness, except if you are immune compromised, if you are old, or if you're very young. And as they say, most people, as they say here, it has circulated for at least 65 years, and nearly every child will be infected by it by the age of 5. Now, as with many of these viruses, immunity is incomplete and reinfections occur throughout adult life. So people are exposed to it all the time. And it may be one of those that causes a stuffy nose, a little bit of temperature, and the symptoms are very, very typical, as it highlighted here. The symptoms are very similar to that of other respiratory viral infections, ranging from a mild cough, stuffy nose, runny nose, that's rhinorrhea, and fever. But in children and immune compromise, it can cause more severe lung disease, bronchiolitis, and pneumonia. And this is the bit that I think is causing the problem. More and more people are becoming vulnerable to the severe bronchiolitis and pneumonia. It's one of these strange times in history where the story of the Pied Piper is coming back. Really strangely, in that I don't think there wants to be an acknowledgement. I have to be careful about how I say this, just as I assume senses are watching me. There, we have to try and understand whether or not the actions in the pandemic have put a cohort who were not really at risk before at very serious risk. And this seems to be what is happening. And that's what the China outbreak is telling us. So just remember this: when you are thinking about yourself, who may be most vulnerable now are young children and the elderly and anyone who is immune compromised. And it's almost as if the epidemic is transitioning to target a different cohort. This is pretty serious. And that's why I'm concerned. And so when I think about the pneumonia that you can get in more severe disease, this is what the lungs look like. This is just a normal lung. This is the trachea into the bronchi, into the bronchioles, and the lungs. You have two lungs in the chest. And essentially, this is where all the gas exchange occurs in the alveoli. And you have about 480 million of these little balloons in your lungs, and they get the blood supply to oxygenate the blood and so on. So this is quite healthy. In the context of a chest x-ray, so this here is showing you the lungs tend to show up dark, and anything that has more tissue tends to show up white. So this is the heart here, and the vertebra here, and this here is the clavicle here, and the dark part represents the lungs. But you will notice that there is a white patch here, and this represents an area of pneumonia. And that is inflammation. And because of the fact that there is inflammation, the x-rays don't pass through it as effectively, and it lights up as being white. And this is what it would look like. because the lungs are no longer just filled with air, the alveoli, they're now filled with this mucus. And the infection is there damaging all of that. And you're having now this infective process that is going on. And this is likely to be what is happening in the context of where people are getting sick. And the worrying part is that this is just warming up. As I said, the COVID super spreader event over the Christmas period will then go into the New Year period, and there seems to be a time delay between the presentation of all these kinds of pneumonia. And just to show you what it looked like in the past, these are the comparisons of chest x rays, and this was taken from automatic classification of COVID 19 pneumonia, non COVID pneumonia. The COVID pneumonia tended to be bilateral. It had a very unique characteristic to it. Most pneumonias are usually unilateral, unless they're bronchopneumonia and they're scattered all around, but most of them are concentrated in one lung. And this is very important because even if you had that lung affected, your other good lung can compensate. But when you have infection involving both sides, because of immune compromise, there's an increased risk of people becoming very unwell. This is pretty serious, as I said. And just for the people who have just joined now, I'm just going to update you as to what is happening in China. And as they said, this is state of emergency as an epidemic overwhelms hospitals and crematoriums. And what I was just talking about here was the human metapneumovirus, HMPV, which is one of the viruses that are circulating. But every one of them on their own, influenza, HMPV, mycoplasma, you're going to see streptococcus, we're going to see a flare up of TB, we're going to see literally everything occurring at this point. That's the problem. And what you need to do is you need to find ways not to get sick. As I said, this is why I wrote the book. I was trying to capture my thoughts and explain everything in a way that made sense. And we've built it in a story format. It is important to read. Are you prepared? Because disease X is not going to be a new virus. It's going to be an increased propensity to all the other viruses because of COVID 19. That's essentially what I'm predicting. You can click here to purchase it on Amazon. You can get the free excerpt and join our newsletter. You can look at some of the testimonials here. The support is valuable. And most importantly, I don't want you to be afraid. You become afraid when you don't know what's happening, when you're dependent on everything around you falling apart. You need to be educated in the science, ask good questions, and prepare accordingly. That's the best that you can do at this point. Don't get caught up, but at the same time, don't ignore what is happening. And that's the point that I made, is that we have two sides of the circle where some people get too frightened and other people just completely ignore it, thinking it's not going to affect them. You need to be in the middle, prepared, ready, understanding what you need to do, and critically, how to protect your health, because there is going to be no room in the hospitals if this continues to expand. So it doesn't matter what is wrong with you, there'll be nobody there to help you because so many people are filling the hospital corridors. We have to try our best now because everybody else seems to be silent or they don't quite know what's going on. So, as I said, remember Disease X, the link is in the description. And don't forget Autoimmunity 101, the body's mysterious attack on itself. When you understand this, you'll understand the implications of the COVID virus occurring or reinfecting people. That's the COVID storm that I've been concerned about. So, as usual, I'm keeping you up to date with the latest information. Take it as you will. But at the end of the day, don't be frightened. But please don't underestimate this virus. It is not done with us, even if you may think you are done with it. Have a good evening.